Throw her out before breakfast. The Duke of Wrenfield did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In the long corridor of his English estate, the words landed against the morning silence like a quiet blade, soft, final, and impossible to take back. Mr. Halford, the old butler of the Wrenfield family, hesitated for the first time in his 30 years of service. Your Grace. Before breakfast, Halford. I want her gone before this house sits down to eat. And 3 doors away, Miss Linnet Carrow, lady's companion to the Dowager Duchess, and the only person in that room with the courage to speak the truth, heard every word. Chapter 1. The words she should not have spoken. The clock in the great hall struck 6. Outside the tall windows of Wrenfield Manor, the first grey light crept across the English countryside, brushing the edges of the estate that belonged to the Wrenfield family for 4 generations. Inside the east wing, the Duke of Wrenfield stood at the window of his private study, hands clasped behind his back, watching the dark recede. Behind him, 3 men sat in matching leather chairs around the long oak table. Mr. Thorne, his land steward, Mr. Beckett, his solicitor, and Mr. Halsey, a banker from London, who arrived in the dark hours before dawn, his boots still damp from the road. A decision waited on that table. 5,000 acres bordering Wrenfield to the south. The estate of Marwick, once one of the finest holdings in the county, now offered at a price that made even the banker speak in soft, careful tones. By noon, Tobias Wrenfield was to sign or refuse. By noon, the duchy's future for the next decade would be set in ink. He did not turn from the window. Read it again, Beckett. The solicitor cleared his throat and read the contract a second time. The terms were generous. The price was steep. The decision was the Duke's, and his alone, and Tobias always preferred his decisions made in silence. In the corridor outside, the soft sound of a tray being lifted broke that silence. Linnet Carrow stood at the foot of the servants' stairs, holding the silver tray with both hands. She was not meant to carry it. Bess, the morning maid, lay upstairs with one of those headaches that came with the change of season, and Mr. Halford found Linnet exactly where he expected, in the library, where she sat every morning at 4:30, reading the day's papers aloud in her head, marking the columns that the Dowager Duchess would want to hear later at breakfast. Miss Carrow, the butler said, lowering his voice to a near whisper, His Grace requires coffee and the girls in the kitchen are pressed. Would you take this in for me? I shall keep the door. She hesitated for only a moment. 6 months in this house taught her the rule. A lady's companion did not serve at a gentleman's meeting. But Halford was the butler, and the house had its silences, and a tray was a tray. Of course, Mr. Halford. The porcelain warmed her hands through the silver. She walked the length of the corridor in slippers that made no sound, and the portraits along the wall watched her pass. Old dukes, departed duchesses, a small boy in a blue coat who must have been the present duke at the age of 7. She did not look at him. She passed this corridor every morning for 6 months, and she taught herself not to look. At the door of the study, Halford reached past her and opened it without a sound. She stepped inside. 3 heads turned. None of them belonged to the Duke. Tobias remained at the window, his back to the room. Linnet felt the absence of his attention like a draught, and was, in equal measure, grateful for it. She moved to the long table. She poured coffee for Mr. Thorne, who gave her a small nod of thanks. She poured for Mr. Beckett, who did not look up from his papers. She paused before the 3rd cup, the banker, Mr. Halsey, and set it down with the same quiet precision. Halsey did not notice her. He was speaking. Your Grace, Marwick is the investment of the decade. The tenants despise the present landlord. The moment Wrenfield's name is on that deed, they will sing it through the south of England. 3 years, perhaps 2, and the land pays for itself. Linnet's hand stilled on the handle of the pot. She knew that name. Marwick. 3 weeks passed. The Dowager received a letter from her sister, Lady Pemberton, who lived in Somerset and wrote with the unfiltered candour of women who outlived most of their secrets. Linnet read the letter aloud that afternoon, by the fire in the east wing, while the old Duchess stitched at her endless embroidery and laughed in places. The Marwick lands are a tragedy, the letter said. 3 farms gone bankrupt this season alone. The soil is spent, drained by 40 years of bad planting. The old Lord Marwick is desperate to find some London fool to take it off his hands before the truth reaches print. Linnet remembered every word. She remembered the Dowager pursing her lips and saying, "Heaven help the man who buys that ruin." And now Mr. Halsey, with his damp boots and his soft, careful tones, was selling that ruin to Tobias as the investment of the decade. She set the coffee pot down on the tray. She turned toward the door. She would say nothing. She was a companion. She was a guest in this house in everything but name. To speak in this room would be to step outside every line drawn around her station, every rule of the 6 silent months she kept. She reached the door, and then she heard her father's voice. That gentle country vicar who raised 5 daughters on a curate's stipend and a wealth of plainer truths, saying what he always said when she was small and afraid to speak. Silence at the wrong moment, Linnet, is only a quieter kind of lie. She turned at the door. She did not raise her voice. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but the Marwick lands are ruined. The soil is spent. 3 farms collapsed this season alone. Lady Pemberton, her Grace's sister, who lives within 10 miles of Marwick, wrote of it 3 weeks past. The tenants do not despise the landlord. They despise the land. If Your Grace signs that contract today, you will lose every shilling within 2 years." A small, perfect curtsy. She walked out. The door closed behind her. With the same quiet care it opened. Inside the study no one spoke. Mr. Thorne studied the ceiling with great interest. Mr. Beckett discovered something fascinating about the corner of his cuff. Mr. Halsey's face travelled through 3 shades, pale, then red, then a careful banker's grey. Tobias Wrenfield turned at last from the window. His eyes, that cold, steady grey his servants knew to fear, moved slowly across the 3 men at his table and then to the closed door where Linnet stepped through a moment before. He did not sit down. "Gentlemen, a moment." He walked out of his own study. In the corridor, Halford stood at his post, the back of his neck very straight. Tobias stopped beside him, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that no servant beyond 5 feet could possibly hear. "Throw her out before breakfast." Halford did not turn. "Your Grace, pay her wages in full for the month. Add a quarter. I do not care where she goes, only that she is gone before this house sits down to eat, before I sit down to eat." A pause. The first pause Halford allowed himself in 30 years of service. "Your Grace, she serves the Dowager. I shall speak with my mother." "Your Grace, Before breakfast, Halford." The Duke walked back into the study. The door closed. Mr. Halford stood very still in the corridor, his hands folded in front of him, the way a man stands when something old and certain just cracked beneath his feet. He did not move for a full minute. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the long passage where Linnet went, and saw at the far end, near the alcove that held the bust of the 3rd Duke, a figure standing very still. She held the empty tray in front of her, like a small silver shield. She heard every word. Chapter 2. What 6 months already knew. The corridor was very long and very quiet, and Linnet did not move. She heard the door of the study close. She heard the soft, careful footsteps of Mr. Halford moving in the other direction, toward the kitchens, where his orders would soon become something real. She heard, far above her in the east wing, the small sound of a bell ring once. The Dowager Duchess, ready for her morning tea. The bell rang again. Linnet did not move. The silver tray pressed cold against the front of her grey morning dress. Her hands were steady. Her breath was steady. She knew, with the kind of quiet clarity that came over her at moments of true disaster, exactly what she would do. She would take the tray to the kitchen. She would go up to the Dowager and pour her tea and read the morning papers as if this day were every other day. She would not weep. She would not explain. And then, when Mr. Halford came to her with whatever sum the Duke saw fit to throw at her departure, she would accept it without comment, pack her single trunk, and walk through those iron gates by 8:30. That was what one did. That was what her father raised her to do. The bell rang a 3rd time. She walked. In the study, Tobias took his seat at the long table. Mr. Halsey was no longer looking at anyone. The banker held his coffee cup between both hands, as if it were the last warm thing in the room. "Mr. Halsey," Tobias said, "you will excuse us." Your Grace, perhaps a clarification. You will excuse us, Mr. Halsey. Mr. Beckett will see you to your carriage. Mr. Thorne will remain. The banker rose. He gathered his papers with the careful motions of a man who knew, finally, that the room was no longer his. Mr. Beckett took him by the elbow with a solicitor's gentle firmness, and the door closed once more. Tobias did not look at Mr. Thorne. He said in that same low voice, "Verify it." Thorne was already on his feet. "The Bath Chronicle keeps a full file in the library. Lady Pemberton's letter, if it still exists, will be in the morning room, with the Dowager's correspondence. I shall return within the hour, Your Grace." "Thorne." "Your Grace." Tobias finally raised his eyes. "Find out who pays Mr. Halsey, and whether any of those payments come from a man named Marwick." Mr. Thorne, who served the Duke for 11 years and rarely permitted himself an expression, allowed the smallest, driest smile. "At once, Your Grace." He left. Tobias remained at the table. He looked at the 3 empty cups and the 4th that was poured but never touched. He looked at the contract, still open on the polished wood, the place for his signature waiting like an open mouth. He thought of the small curtsy at the door. He thought of the steady voice that did not tremble even once. He thought of his own voice in the corridor, 3 minutes past, telling Halford to put her out of the house before breakfast. He stood up so fast that his chair scraped the floor. The Dowager Duchess of Wrenfield took her tea at 6:30 in a high-backed chair by the east-facing window of her private sitting-room, with a small fire lit even in summer, and a tabby cat named Marlowe asleep on the cushion at her feet. Linnet entered with the tray exactly on time. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning, child." The old Duchess studied her companion for a moment over the rim of her spectacles. Lady Augusta Wrenfield was 71 years old, and she lost very little to age except the use of her left knee and the patience for slow conversation. Her eyes were the same cool grey as her son's, and they missed nothing. "You are quite pale, Linnet." "The morning is cold, ma'am." "The morning is warm, child. The morning is warm since Tuesday." A pause. "Pour the tea and tell me what has occurred." Linnet poured the tea. She set the small silver strainer on its plate. She arranged the slice of dry toast the Dowager preferred over anything else. She placed the morning paper, folded to the 2nd page, within reach. She did all of it with hands that did not shake. And then, because Lady Augusta Wrenfield never tolerated a half-answer in her life, Linnet spoke. "His Grace has asked Mr. Halford to dismiss me before breakfast, ma'am. I served coffee at his meeting this morning. I offered a remark on the Marwick lands, a remark drawn from Lady Pemberton's letter, which I read aloud to you 3 weeks past. The remark was unwelcome." The Dowager set down her cup. She did not speak for a long moment. "Sit down, Linnet." "Ma'am, the morning papers." "Sit down, child." Linnet sat. The cat Marlowe opened one yellow eye, considered her, and went back to sleep. The Dowager looked at her companion for a long, careful moment, and then she said something that did not sound at all like a question. "My son told the butler to dismiss you for speaking the truth at his table." "For speaking out of turn, ma'am." "For speaking the truth, child. There is a difference, though my son spent 34 years pretending there is not." She lifted her teacup again, with that small tremor of the elderly hand that no one in the household ever remarked upon. "Drink your tea. We shall sit a moment." "Your Grace, I should pack—" "You shall do nothing of the sort. You shall sit in that chair, and you shall drink your tea, and you shall let me think." Linnet sat. She drank her tea. She thought of the 6 months that brought her to this chair. She arrived at Wrenfield Manor on the 1st day of December with a single trunk and a recommendation from a viscountess in Bath. Mr. Halford received her at the door, took her trunk without comment, and led her to the east wing where the Dowager waited with a cup of tea already poured for a stranger she did not yet meet. That was the first kindness. The library was the second. On her 3rd morning in the house, unable to sleep in a bed that was still strange to her, Linnet went down at 4:30 to find a book. She lit a single candle. She chose a volume of poetry from the lower shelf. She sat in the armchair near the eastern window, the one that caught the first light, and read until the rest of the house began to stir. On the 4th morning, she did the same. On the 5th, the Duke walked in. She rose at once. She curtsied. He looked at her as a man looks at a piece of furniture moved without his consent, and then, without a word, he sat down at the writing desk on the other side of the room and began to work. He did not dismiss her. He did not greet her. He simply allowed her to remain. She returned the next morning. He came the next morning. Neither of them spoke. That was the third kindness, though it took her 4 months to understand it as one. 6 months of mornings. 6 months of 2 candles burning at opposite ends of the same room. 6 months of a quiet that, by April, ceased to feel like a stranger's quiet and began to feel like something that belonged to her, to them, to the small private hour of the day that neither of them surrendered. And now this morning she ruined it with a sentence about the Marwick soil. She set down her empty teacup. The Dowager was watching her with those grey eyes that missed nothing. Linnet. Ah, yes, ma'am. Do not pack your trunk. Ma'am, His Grace, my son will be at this door within the hour, and when he arrives I shall remind him that he is, before he is Duke of anything, the boy I taught to apologize. Drink another cup. Linnet did not move. The Dowager smiled. A small, sharp smile that her own son did not see in 20 years. And then, my dear, we shall see whether he remembers his lesson. Chapter 3. The Dowager's quiet war. Tobias took the stairs to the east wing 2 at a time. He did not know precisely what he meant to say to his mother. He knew only that Mr. Thorne would return within the hour with a verified copy of the Marwick figures, and that when those figures arrived, a man named Halsey would be ruined in 3 counties before nightfall. He knew that he stood 6 minutes past in his own corridor and ordered a butler to put a woman out of his house before she finished her breakfast. He knew that the woman in question was, at this very moment, drinking tea 2 doors away with the only person in the world whose opinion he was raised to fear. He reached the door of his mother's sitting room. He raised his hand to knock. He did not knock. He stood at that door with his fist suspended in the air, and for the first time since he was a boy of 7, the Duke of Wrenfield did not know what to do with his own hand. The door opened from the inside. "Come in, Tobias. Do not stand in the passage like a footman." He came in. The Dowager Duchess sat exactly where she always sat, the small fire at her feet, the cat Marlowe asleep on the cushion, the morning paper folded to the 2nd page. There was a teacup beside her, and a second beside the chair across from her, the chair that, 6 months past, Linnet Carrow took for the first time. That second chair was empty. The room smelled of black tea and dry toast. "Where is Miss Carrow?" Tobias said. "At her writing desk, packing nothing on my instructions. Sit down." He did not sit. "Mother." "Sit down, Tobias." He sat. He sat in the chair across from his mother, the chair that was not his chair, and he looked at the cooling teacup on the small table between them, and he felt out for the first time in his adult life entirely young. His mother did not pour him tea. That too was a thing. "You ordered Halford to dismiss her before breakfast." "Yes." "Speak." "She spoke at my table, in front of 3 men of London. She corrected my judgment in a matter of business worth £100,000. She prevented your judgment from costing you £100,000. That is not the point." "Then what, my son, is the point?" He did not answer. The Dowager waited. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still. The small tremor that touched her wrist these past 2 winters was, for the moment, gone. She had long practice with silence. So did her son. A clock somewhere in the wing struck the 1/4 hour. Marlowe stretched a single grey paw and resettled. "I shall help you," the Dowager said at last, "for I watched a great many men sit in that chair and refuse to answer a question, and I know what the silence means. The point, Tobias, is that she spoke. That alone. Not the words, not the lands, not the banker. She spoke in your presence after 6 months of taking great care never to speak in your presence, and you discovered, at the sound of her voice in your own study, that you cannot bear the consequence of being known." He looked at the fire. "Mother, I am not finished." He looked at the fire. "I am 71 years old, Tobias. I observed this household from this very chair for 6 months. I observed my own son rise at 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning of those 6 months, and take himself down to the library. I observed my companion rise at the same hour and go to the same room. I observed my son alter the path of his afternoon walks to pass through the long gallery at 11, where my companion sits with the mending. I observed my companion decline a position in London with a salary nearly twice what I pay her, and tell no one of it but Mr. Halford in confidence, Mr. Halford who tells me everything. She lifted her cup. I am old, child. I am not blind. Tobias did not move. And this morning, she continued, after 6 months of careful silence, she spoke a sentence that saved your estate from ruin, and you ordered her thrown out of the house before breakfast. She set her cup down. Why? He did not answer. Tobias? Why? The fire shifted in the grate. A small log fell. A spray of orange embers rose and faded against the back stones. Because, he said finally, if she remained in this house after speaking, if she remained as my mother's companion, as a paid woman of the household, after speaking that sentence in front of 3 men of London, I should have to decide what she was to me. And I spent 12 years, Mother, refusing to decide what anyone is to me. The Dowager Duchess looked at her son. For the first time since he was a boy of 17, and his father lay in the great bedroom with the curtains drawn, she looked at him with something close to pity. And then, because the woman she was beneath the title would not permit pity to stand alone, she looked at him with something else. Then decide, Tobias, for the first time in your adult life, decide. Mother, I shall lose her too, my son. She is the only company in this house that still reminds me of who I was, and you are about to send her through the gates before breakfast because you are afraid of a question. Decide. He stood. He did not know he was going to stand until he was standing. Where is she? At her desk, folding a shawl she does not need to fold, stalling. Mother. Go, Tobias. He reached the door. Tobias. He turned. His mother was looking at him with the smallest smile he saw on her face in 20 years. Whatever you say to her, say it as her son, not as your title. A great many titles were spoken at her in her life, and they all walked away. He nodded once. He left. Linnet was, in fact, folding a shawl. She folded it once, lengthwise, the way her mother taught her at the age of 9. She set it on the bed beside her trunk. She lifted it again. She unfolded it. She refolded it. She did this 6 times. She was a woman of considerable composure, Linnet Carrow, but composure had its limits, and she reached hers somewhere between the 2nd and the 3rd fold. There were footsteps in the corridor. They were not Mr. Halford's footsteps. She knew Mr. Halford's footsteps, slow even, the small drag of the left foot from his old knee. These were quicker, heavier. She set the shawl down. She did not turn toward the door. The footsteps stopped on the other side. There was a pause, the kind of pause that in any other house was nothing, and in this house on this morning was everything. A knock. She closed her eyes for one breath. She opened them. She did not need to call out, "Come in." The door opened on its own. The Duke of Wrenfield stood in her doorway. His coat was unbuttoned. His hair was less neat than at 6 o'clock. There was a faint colour in his face that she did not see there in 6 months of watching him at 4:30 in the morning, and she did not yet know what to call it. He did not speak at once. She did. "Your Grace, the trunk is nearly finished. I shall be gone before Miss Carrow." "Your Grace." He stepped into the room. He closed the door behind him. And the Duke of Wrenfield, who ordered her out of his house at 6 minutes past 6 in the morning, and who in the corridors of London was known for never crossing the threshold of a woman's room, said very quietly, "Do not finish the trunk." Chapter 4. Before breakfast. "Do not finish the trunk." Linnet looked at him. She spent 6 months learning the precise shape of his silences. The silence of the man at the writing desk, the silence of the man at the long gallery window, the silence of the man who passed her in a corridor and did not nod. She knew the shape of those silences as well as she knew her own handwriting. She did not know the shape of this one. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. "Mr. Halford was instructed to dismiss me. I am, of course, prepared to leave with the dignity such a house deserves. There is no need for your Grace to—" "Linnet." She stopped. He never spoke her given name in 6 months, not once. He said it now as a man says a word he is afraid he will forget. "Forgive me," he said. "Miss Carrow, forgive me. I am poor at this." He took one step further into the room. He did not approach her. He simply moved enough to allow the door to close fully behind him, and then he stood with his hands behind his back, the way he stood at his own window at 6 o'clock that morning, looking at a different kind of grey. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "verified your account of the Marwick lands. Lady Pemberton's letter is in the morning room exactly where you said it would be. The Bath Chronicle of the 11th of June confirms 3 farms in collapse. Mr. Halsey, as it transpires, holds a quiet partner's interest in the brokerage handling the sale, and his name is on 3 commissions paid out of the Marwick estate in the last 12 months. By tonight, he will be ruined in 3 counties. By the end of the month in London." He paused. "You saved this house from a loss of £100,000, Miss Carrow." "Yes, Your Grace." "And I, 6 minutes after you saved it, ordered the butler to put you out of it before breakfast." "Yes, Your Grace." "Linnet." She closed her eyes. She opened them. She did not this time correct him. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "you do not owe me an apology. I overstepped. A lady's companion does not speak at a gentleman's table. The fault was mine. I shall be grateful for the wages of the month, and I shall not—" "You did not overstep." "I did, Your Grace." "You did not. You spoke at a table where 4 men were preparing to ruin this estate, and 3 of them were too proud, and 1 of them too dishonest, to say what they knew or to find what they did not. You spoke because no one else in that room would. And I—" He stopped. She waited. "And I," he said, "discovered at the sound of your voice in my own study that I lived in this house for 12 years as a man who was not spoken to. And I did not know that was the matter with me until I heard you speak." The room was very quiet. The shawl lay on the bed between them, folded for the 7th time. "Your Grace," she said, I do not know what to say to that." "Then I shall say the rest, and you may answer when you wish." He took one breath. 6 months past, I came down to my library at 4:30 in the morning, and I found a stranger in the chair by the eastern window. I sat down at my desk. I did not greet her. I worked. The next morning she was there again. The next, the same. By the 2nd month, I rose at 4 o'clock instead of 4:30, and I told myself it was to make better use of the day. By the 3rd, I altered the path of my afternoon walk to pass through the long gallery at 11, and I told myself it was to inspect the roof. By the 4th, I declined 3 invitations to London for reasons I could not name to my own steward. He looked at her. By the 5th, I knew. I told myself I did not know, but I knew. And by the 6th, by this very morning, I sat at the long table in my study, 3 men around me, a contract under my hand, and I noticed nothing of the world until a tray was set beside me and a sentence was spoken at my door. He shook his head once, very small. "I ordered you out, Linnet, because if I let you stay 1 more hour, I would have to know what you are to me. And I spent 12 years not knowing what anyone is to me. It was easier to send you through the gates than to answer my own question." She did not speak. She could not. "My mother," he said, "told me 10 minutes past that I was about to send you away before breakfast because I was afraid of a question. She instructed me to decide. So I am here, Miss Carrow, deciding, for the first time in my adult life." He stepped at last closer. He did not touch her. He did not lift his hand. He simply stood 3 feet away, with the morning light cutting a long pale stripe across the floor between them, and he said the sentence he did not say to any living person in 12 years. "Stay." "Your Grace, not as my mother's companion, not as a paid woman of this household. I cannot pay you to remain in this house after this morning, and I would not insult you with the attempt. Stay, Miss Carrow, as my wife. Stay because I am asking, and because no one in this house and no one in this corner of England ever asked you a thing without paying for it. I am asking." The clock in the corridor struck the half-hour, 8:30. Below them, somewhere in the great house, the small sounds of breakfast began. The chink of china, the soft tread of a footman across the dining-room floor, the thin scent of fresh bread climbing the stairs. Before breakfast. He proposed before breakfast. Linnet looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were no longer behind his back. She looked at his coat, still unbuttoned. She looked at his face, which she observed at 4:30 in the morning for 6 months, and never, until this moment, saw. She drew a breath. She let it out. "Your Grace." "Tobias, if you would." "Your Grace," she said, with the smallest, most private smile he ever saw on her face. "I was a woman of careful composure for 27 years. I shall need a moment." "Of course, I shall need," she said, "perhaps more than a moment." He looked at her. "Take it," he said. "Take any moment you require. I shall be in the library." He turned. He reached the door. He stopped. He did not look back at her. He spoke to the door. "I sat in that library at 4:30 every morning for 6 months, Linnet, and I shall sit there tomorrow morning at the same hour. I shall sit there every morning until you tell me to go, or to stay, or to leave you in peace. There is no haste. There is not a moment of haste in this house in 6 months. You will give me your answer when you are ready." He opened the door. "And, Miss Carrow, Your Grace, you need not fold that shawl an 8th time." He went out. The door closed. Linnet stood very still by the bed, with the morning light falling across the folded shawl, and she put one hand to her own throat as if she were not entirely certain that her pulse was still her own. The clock struck the 3/4. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not, in the end, fold the shawl again. Chapter 5. The Vicarage in Hartwood. The carriage left Wrenfield Manor at 10 o'clock in the morning. Linnet sat alone in the seat that faced forward, with her single trunk strapped above the rear axle, and a small basket of provisions from Mrs. Penley, the cook, on the bench beside her. The Duke remained at the gate to see her off, with his hands behind his back and his coat now buttoned, and he did not raise his hand as the carriage turned onto the south road. He granted her 4 days. 4 days to ride to her father's vicarage at Hartwood, 3 counties distant. 4 days to think. 4 days, he said, with the steady gravity of a man who finally understood the cost of asking, in which she owed him nothing, not a letter, not a promise, not the courtesy of a return. "If you do not come back, Miss Carrow, the carriage is yours. I shall not send for it." She agreed to the 4 days because she could not refuse the gentleness of them, and because a woman of careful composure did not say yes to a proposal of marriage in a corridor at 8:30 in the morning to a man whose name she only ever spoke to a teapot. She watched the gates of Wrenfield recede through the small carriage window. Mr. Halford stood at the top step of the great house with his hands folded in front of him. The Dowager Duchess watched from the east wing window. The Duke remained at the gate until the carriage was out of sight. Linnet, who possessed considerable composure, found her hand resting once more at her own throat. She lowered it. She watched the English countryside pass. The vicarage at Hartwood stood on a small rise of land where 3 lanes met, with a low stone wall, a kitchen garden gone slightly wild, and a single old yew tree at the corner of the churchyard. The carriage drew up at the gate of that wall on the afternoon of the 2nd day. The Reverend James Carrow came out of the front door in his shirt-sleeves, with ink on the side of his hand, and his spectacles pushed up into his hair, and he stopped halfway down the path, as if he could not quite credit his own eyes. "Linnet!" "Father." "Child, I received no letter." "I know, Father. There was no time for a letter." He embraced her at the gate. He was a small man, the Reverend Carrow, considerably shorter than his 4th daughter, and he held her with the careful, embarrassed tenderness of a country clergyman who raised 5 girls on a curate's stipend and a great quantity of love he never quite knew how to spend. "Come in, child, come in. Mrs. Wickham is at market. There is tea. There is bread, I believe. Come in." She came in. The parlour of the vicarage was small and low-ceilinged, with a fire that was never quite large enough, and a writing desk under the window where the Reverend Carrow composed his sermons in the careful, looping hand he refused to alter, even when his daughters teased him for it. There were 2 armchairs by the fire. Linnet sat in the one she always sat in, and her father sat in the one he always sat in, and Mrs. Wickham, the vicar's housekeeper of long standing, returned from market within the half-hour and set down tea before either of them found the courage to speak of consequence. When Mrs. Wickham withdrew, the Reverend Carrow looked at his daughter over the rim of his teacup. "Linnet, begin at the beginning." She began at the beginning. She told him of the morning, of the tray, of the banker named Halsey and the lands at Marwick and the sentence she could not quite swallow at the door, of the silver shield of the empty tray and the words she heard in the corridor, of the Dowager Duchess who instructed her to drink another cup, of the shawl she folded 7 times, and of the Duke. She told him of the Duke at her doorway with his coat unbuttoned, and the proposal of marriage spoken in a voice he did not use to any living person in 12 years. The Reverend Carrow listened without interrupting. He listened the way he listened to his parishioners, with his head a little to one side and his hands folded over his teacup, and his eyes fixed on something just past her shoulder, as if to look at her directly would interrupt the flow of her words. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. He set down his teacup. "Child, father, you are not asking me, I think, whether you should marry the Duke of Wrenfield." She looked at her hands. "No, father, I do not believe I am. You are asking me, though perhaps you do not yet know it, whether a woman of careful composure is permitted to want a thing." She did not answer. The Reverend Carrow lifted his teacup once more and turned it slowly in his hand. "Your mother," he said, "when she agreed to marry me, was the prettiest girl in 3 parishes and the granddaughter of a barrister of some consequence. I was the 3rd son of a country surgeon, with no living and no prospect, and altogether too much opinion about the Book of Common Prayer. Her family told her, in considerable detail and on many occasions, that she ought not to want me." He smiled at the cup. "She wanted me anyway." He looked up. "You were raised, Linnet, to be useful. You were raised to be the 4th of 5 daughters in a household where there was much love and very little money, and you learned by the age of 11 that wanting a thing was a luxury we could not afford. You learned to want what was practical. You learned to want what was decent. You learned never to want anything that asked the world to bend toward you." She felt her eyes sting. She did not on principle weep, but her composure, much tested in the past 48 hours, found a new limit in her father's small front parlour, and she lowered her face to her teacup. "Linnet, father, you are permitted to want this." He set down his cup. "You are permitted to want a man who watched you for 6 months in a library at 4:30 in the morning and never said a word until the morning you spoke. You are permitted to want a household where what you speak is not measured against your station. You are permitted, child, to want the great foolish exposed business of being known by another person." A small log shifted in the grate. "The question you must answer," he said, "is not whether the Duke is worthy of you. He proved himself by your own account capable of an apology, which is more than most dukes manage in a lifetime. The question is whether you trust your own wanting. Whether you can step into that house, child, not as my 4th daughter and not as the Dowager's companion, but as Linnet, and live there, in front of a man, as Linnet, for the rest of your days." She looked up. "Father, I do not know." "Then take the 4 days, Linnet. He gave you 4. He did not, I think, give them out of generosity. He gave them because he is not yet a fool, and he understood that a woman of your character does not say yes in a corridor." He reached across, and with a tenderness so unaccustomed it nearly undid her, laid one ink-stained hand over both of hers. "I shall be here, child. Whatever you decide, I shall be here, and I shall be proud, and I shall sleep well in either case. Now, you will eat, and you will sleep in your old room, and we shall not speak of the Duke again until the morning." Mrs. Wickham saved a pie. "I do not believe I am permitted to tell you what is in it." She laughed. It was the first sound of laughter she made in 2 days, and it surprised her so much that she pressed her hand to her mouth as if to hold the rest of it back. The Reverend Carrow rose, with the slow, careful movement of a man who knew the limits of his own knee, and he went to call Mrs. Wickham for the pie. Linnet sat by the fire with her hand still pressed to her mouth and looked into the small flames. She did not, on principle, know her own answer. She did, on principle, suspect it. Chapter 6. Halsey's Revenge. The first letter arrived at Wrenfield Manor on the morning of the 3rd day. It was carried by a riding messenger from London, sealed with the small grey wax of a club Tobias avoided for 4 years, and written in the careful, sloping hand of a man who once stood up at Eton on his behalf when he was 15. Lord Edward Pembury, now of the Pembury Bank, of 2 seats in the city, and of a wife who corresponded weekly with half the drawing-rooms in Mayfair, wrote with the dryness of an old friend who took no pleasure in his errand. Wrenfield, a small piece of intelligence reaches me, and I send it on at once. A certain Mr. Halsey, until recently of considerable repute in this quarter, and now of none, dined last evening at a chop-house off Fleet Street, in the company of 3 gentlemen of the press. He spoke at length, and with the particular candour of a man who lost everything in a single morning, of an episode at your estate involving a lady's companion, a tray of coffee, and a decision of business he claims was reversed at the suggestion of the said companion. I tell you no more than the substance, my friend, and only because the substance reaches the columns of the Morning Post by Saturday next. Be advised, act if you wish. Burn this when you are done. Yours in the old loyalty. E.P. Tobias read the letter twice. He set it down on the desk in his study. He looked at the window, where the morning light fell in the same long stripe across the same wood floor where, 80-some hours past, a tray of coffee was set down by a hand he could no longer pretend was a stranger's. He rang the bell. Mr. Halford appeared at the door within 30 seconds. Halford, Your Grace, Mr. Thorne, the library, at once, and send a man to the Dowager, present my compliments and ask whether she will receive me at her convenience. At once, Your Grace. Halford withdrew. Tobias stood at the desk for a moment longer. He picked up the letter. He folded it once, twice, and slid it inside the breast of his coat. He did not burn it. Some letters were for keeping. Mr. Thorne arrived in the library inside of 3 minutes, with 2 volumes of estate ledgers under one arm, and the particular still attention of a man who served the Duke for 11 years and knew, by the angle of his Grace's shoulders, when a matter was no longer about land. Your Grace. Thorne, sit. Thorne sat. A man named Halsey, Tobias said, dined last evening at a chop-house off Fleet Street and spoke unwisely to 3 gentlemen of the press. By Saturday next, the Morning Post intends to print a story concerning a lady's companion of this household and the events of Tuesday morning. The story will, by all the means available to such a paper, treat Miss Carrow with the precise variety of contempt the public reserves for women in her position. He paused. That will not occur. Your Grace, the Morning Post is a paper of some... It will not occur, Thorne. I am informing you of the matter so that you may know what occupies my mornings for the remainder of this week. I am not asking your counsel on the question of whether. Of course, Your Grace. I require 3 things. The first, and most pressing, is the precise nature of Mr. Halsey's remaining holdings. The second is the precise nature of his debts. The third is the name of every gentleman of the press in London who, as of this morning, may yet be persuaded to find the story uninteresting. Mr. Thorne, who in his 11 years of service to Wrenfield never once saw the Duke move at speed in a matter that did not concern the soil or the rent, did not on this occasion ask why. By the end of the day, Your Grace. By noon, Thorne. By noon. Mr. Thorne rose and withdrew. The Duke of Wrenfield stood by the window of his library a moment longer, with the morning light on his hands. He did not think of Halsey. He thought of a small front parlour somewhere in a county he never visited, where a country vicar was very likely at this hour pouring tea for his 4th daughter, and asking her a question Tobias was not yet permitted to hear the answer to. He turned from the window. He went to find his mother. The Dowager Duchess received her son in the East Wing sitting-room with a small frown already arranged between her brows and a cup of tea poured for him without inquiry. Sit, Tobias. I read the Morning Post. I did not yet read the Morning Post. I trust you are here about the second. I am, mother. Halsey. Halsey. Tobias, the man is ruined. What more is there? A ruined man who lost in a single morning what he spent a life acquiring is precisely the kind of man who reaches for a newspaper. The story will involve Miss Carrow. I shall not permit it. The Dowager set down her cup. She looked at her son for a long moment. Tobias. Mother, you understand, I trust, that the only certain way to remove Miss Carrow's name from a London paper is to replace it with a different name. I am aware, Mother. You are aware that I do not refer to the alteration of a paper. I am aware. The Dowager Duchess studied him with the particular grey attention she once turned upon his Greek tutor, his first horse, and the first of his juvenile decisions, of which she did not approve. You proposed to announce the engagement before she accepted. I proposed, Tobias said carefully, to write to Lord Pembury this morning, and to Lord Ainsworth at the Morning Post, and to such other gentlemen of the press as Mr. Thorne shall name to me by noon, and to inform them that any reference, however oblique, to a lady's companion of this household will be considered a reference to the future Duchess of Wrenfield, and treated accordingly. I propose to make no announcement of fact. I propose rather to make a threat of consequence. Tobias, Mother, that is, and I say this in considerable surprise, well done. He bowed his head a quarter-inch. There remains, however, one matter. Mother? She did not yet say yes. No, Mother. And if she returns from Hartwood and tells you no? He looked at the small fire, he took a breath, he let it out. Then the threat shall remain in place. Miss Carrow's name shall not be touched, and I shall, in the matter of the future Duchess of Wrenfield, have lied to 2 earls and 1 editor of the Morning Post, and I shall write to them again in another letter, and inform them I was mistaken. The Dowager Duchess looked at her son. For the second time in 5 days, she allowed herself a smile he did not see on her face in 20 years. My son, go and write your letters. He rose. He bent, and for the first time in 7 years, kissed his mother on the forehead. He went out. The Dowager Duchess looked at the closed door for a long moment, then at Marlowe the cat, who observed the entire conversation through one yellow eye. Well, Marlowe, she said, it would seem the boy at last learned the use of a pen. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, 3 letters left Wrenfield by separate messengers. By 8 o'clock that evening, in a coffee-house off Fleet Street, an editor of the Morning Post read his and folded it very carefully into his breast pocket. By midnight, the story of the lady's companion was no longer of any interest to anyone in London, and in a small front parlour in Hartwood, 3 counties distant, a country vicar's daughter sat by a low fire and looked into the flames with a teacup gone cold in her hands. She did not yet know about the letters. She did, however, know her answer. Chapter 7. The answer at 5 in the morning. The carriage returned to Wrenfield Manor on the morning of the 4th day, at 23 minutes past 4, in a soft summer dark that did not yet commit to dawn. Linnet stepped down at the gate. She left the carriage and the driver and her single trunk in the gravel of the front court, with only the small message that Mr. Halford was, on no account, to be roused before 5, and she walked, in her travelling cloak and her sensible boots, up the long drive of the only house in 3 counties where she felt the peculiar and inconvenient sensation of belonging. The east wing windows were dark. The library windows were not. A single candle burned in the window seat by the eastern panes, the seat that, 6 months past, she chose without knowing what she was choosing. She did not go to the front door. She went, by the side path she now knew as well as her own hand, to the library. Tobias was at the writing desk. He was not, in fact, writing. He sat at the desk with a pen in his hand and a sheet of paper before him, and he sat in precisely that position for 40 minutes, and the pen did not yet touch the page. The latch of the side door lifted. He did not turn his head. He rose at 3:30. He sat in this chair at 4 o'clock, as he sat in this chair for 180 mornings before, and he resolved, with the same quiet finality, he resolved to write 3 letters 2 days past, that he would sit in this chair every morning until the carriage returned. He would not look at the side door. He would not start at every shift of the boards. He would do what he did every morning for 6 months. He would work. He did not, in 40 minutes, work. The latch lifted. The door opened. He did not turn. Soft footsteps. The small whisper of a travelling cloak on the boards. The sound, entirely particular, of a woman setting down a glove on a sideboard. He set down the pen. He turned. She stood inside the door of the library in her grey travelling cloak, with the hood lowered and the morning dust still on the hem, and the candle in the window threw the long stripe of its light across the wood floor between them. She did not approach. He did not rise. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The library at 4:30 in the morning was a place that did not permit haste, and they were old friends by now with the rules of this room. "Your Grace." "Linnet." She set her hand on the back of the chair beside the writing desk. She did not sit. She stood with one hand on the carved wood, the way one stands when one is not yet certain whether one is a guest. "I came," she said, "to give you an answer." He inclined his head a fraction. "I shall give it," she said, "in the manner I should like to give the rest of my life, which is plainly, and at 4:30 in the morning, and to you." He waited. "Yes, Tobias." He did not move. "Yes," she said again, more quietly, as if the word required two pronouncements to take root in the room. "Yes, I shall marry you. Yes, I shall stay in this house, not as a companion to your mother, and not as a paid woman of the household, but as the woman in the chair by the eastern window. Yes, I shall sit in that chair at 4:30 every morning of every year we are given, and I shall let you sit at that desk, and I shall not, on principle, speak before the second cup of tea." A small dry humour. The first he heard from her at this hour in 6 months. He rose at last from the desk. He did not cross the room at once. He stood by the chair, with one hand resting on the back of it, in a mirror of her own hand on the chair by the door. "Linnet." "Tobias." "I have a great many things to say to you. I shall say none of them well. I shall in fact ruin most of them. I beg your patience in advance." "You have it, Your Grace." "Tobias, if you would." "Tobias." He crossed the room. He stopped 1 pace from her, the same 1 pace he kept in her doorway 4 mornings past, the careful pace of a man who never crossed a threshold without leave. He did not, this time, lower his hand. He raised it. He laid the tips of 2 fingers along the line of her cheek, with a tenderness so unaccustomed it seemed to take both of them by surprise. He did not, in the manner of dukes in books, sweep her into his arms. He did not, in the manner of bolder men, claim her. He simply touched her face, once lightly the way a man verifies that a thing he was told is true is, in fact, true, and waited to see whether she would step back. She did not step back. She lifted her own hand and placed it palm flat over his, and held his fingers there a moment longer against her cheek, as if she required confirmation of her own. "Tobias." "Yes." "I should very much like," she said, "to be kissed by my future husband in the library where he failed for 6 months to speak to me." He almost laughed. He did not in the event quite manage a laugh, but a small shift of his mouth occurred that, on another man, might have one day developed into one with practice. He bent his head. He kissed her. It was not a long kiss. It was not by any account a bold one. It was the careful, unhurried kiss of a man who waited 6 months without knowing what he waited for, and the library at 4:30 in the morning held them both with the particular grace of a room that knew their secret, long before either of them did. When he drew back, he did not step away. He kept one hand at the line of her jaw. He took from the inner pocket of his coat a small object he carried there for 2 days, a ring, plain in design, old of his grandmother's grandmother, the ring of the House of Wrenfield that, by tradition, was placed only upon a finger that was wanted there. He did not kneel. He had, in the long history of his pride, only one knee he was willing to set aside this morning, and it was the metaphorical one. He took her left hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. "Linnet Carrow," he said quietly. "Be the Duchess of this house. Be the woman in the chair by the eastern window. Be, for as long as we are given, mine." "Tobias Wrenfield," she said, with the smallest, steadiest smile he ever saw on her face. "I shall." The candle in the window burned a little lower. Outside, the first grey light moved across the English countryside, across the south road, across the gates of Wrenfield, across the trunk still sitting in the gravel of the front court, where in some 40 minutes Mr. Halford was to discover it, with the particular still surprise of a butler, who in his 30 years of service never once was wrong about a returning carriage, and was not on this occasion wrong either. Inside the library, the Duke of Wrenfield held the hand of the future Duchess of Wrenfield, and they did not for the moment speak. There would be time for speaking. There would, by all accounts, be a long time yet for speaking. Epilogue. 3 chairs at dawn. It was, by the calendar of Wrenfield Manor, the 2nd morning of October. The library at 4:30 held the same quiet it held on every morning of the 10 months past, with the candle in the eastern window seat lit in the same place it was lit on the first day of Linnet's arrival, the first day of her speaking, and the first day of her returning. There were, however, 3 chairs. The first was the chair by the window, Linnet's chair by every right of habit, and a small brass plate Mr. Halford caused to be fixed to the back of it in August, on which was inscribed in modest letters, "For Her Grace, the Duchess of Wrenfield, who reads here." The second was the writing chair at the desk, the Duke's by every right of habit and 4 generations of unbroken use, on which Mr. Halford did not propose any brass plate, on the grounds that a duke who required a plate to know his own chair was a duke in need of more breakfast. The third was new. It was a smaller chair, of older wood drawn up between the two, and set with a soft tartan rug folded across the seat. The Dowager Duchess took it for the first time on the morning after the wedding, with Marlowe the cat under one arm and the air of a woman who intended to be invited from now on. The Duke and Duchess of Wrenfield, after a brief exchange of glances that contained, for 2 persons of their composure, an entire conversation, agreed that she should. So it was, every morning since. 3 chairs, 3 cups, 2 candles now instead of 1 because the Dowager preferred her own light for her own paper. This particular morning, Tobias was at the desk with the estate ledgers and a letter from Lord Pembury that contained more affection than business, which was, in its small way, a sign of how thoroughly the world agreed to leave the Duchess of Wrenfield alone. Linnet was in her chair by the window with the Bath Chronicle. The Dowager was in the new chair with a copy of a French novel her sister Lady Pemberton sent from Somerset, which she pretended to read in disapproval and clearly enjoyed. Marlowe was on the Dowager's lap. There was in the room a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of 3 people who knew one another's silences well enough not to fill them. The clock in the great hall struck 5. The Dowager turned a page. Tobias, Mother. I should like to remark, and I shall remark it only once, and then we shall return to our reading, that there is, in this corner of England, no household at this hour better governed than mine, and I take in this no particular credit. I merely note it. Tobias did not look up from the ledgers. Mother, yes. You take, in fact, considerable credit. I do, Tobias. I take considerable credit. I merely chose, in this moment, to be modest about it. Linnet, behind the Bath Chronicle, did not lift her face. The Chronicle did, however, tremble very slightly, in the way a newspaper trembles when the person behind it is laughing without permitting herself to make a sound. The Dowager smiled at the French novel. Marlowe opened one yellow eye. Linnet, my dear. Yes, ma'am. I informed you, I trust, that the late Duke proposed to me in a garden at a very respectable hour of the afternoon, with a great many roses and a small string quartet. You did, ma'am. I came, the Dowager said, after some reflection, to the view that my son's method was the better one. Tobias set down his pen. He looked at his mother. His mother turned a page of her French novel. It is the first compliment, Tobias, you received from me on the subject. I should not expect another for at least a season. I shall hoard it carefully, Mother. You shall. He picked up the pen. He did not write. He looked across the room at his wife in the chair by the eastern window, who lowered the Bath Chronicle just enough to look back at him over the top of it. She did not speak. She did not need to. The first grey light of the 2nd morning of October moved across the floor of the library and reached at last the toe of her slipper, and Tobias Wrenfield, Duke of Wrenfield, who in the long silence of his 34th year was a man no one in his own house once properly spoke to, smiled. It was not a large smile, it was, however, his. Some months later, in the village of Hartwood, 3 counties south, the Reverend James Carrow received a letter in the careful looping hand of his 4th daughter. It informed him that a small godchild was, in the natural course of things, expected in the spring. It informed him further that the Duke wished it to be known that, if the child was a girl, she should very much like to be called Augusta. And it informed him that the Dowager Duchess, on being told of this, replied that she would consider the matter, and that in any event the child would be welcome to her chair. The Reverend Carrow read the letter twice. He set it down on the small writing desk under the window. He went to the kitchen to inform Mrs. Wickham, who was at that moment putting a pie in the oven and who said only, "Well, sir, I shall make another." He returned to the parlour. He took up his pen. He wrote, in the same looping hand, a single line of reply. "Tell the Duke that a vicar's grandchild is, of course, welcome to any chair she chooses, including his." He sealed it. He sent it by the morning post. And so we leave the Duke and his Duchess to their library, their candles and their morning silences. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I shall see you, dear listener, for the next story.